Today we're talking to Cynthia Chung, who is the president of the Rising Tide Foundation and a writer for Strategic Culture Foundation. Cynthia, welcome to the Space Commune podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I came across an article that you wrote earlier this year in January called "What Determines a Limit to Growth," which is a great title, countering the famous book by the Club of Rome called Limits to Growth, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they released that in 1972, and that was pretty much what the World Economic Forum adopted at its very inception, pretty much the year after the World Economic Forum was founded. They introduced the Club of Rome policy outlook.
So we're going on 50 years now with these Club of Rome policies that were set up by Limits to Growth, a study done by MIT, by Donella Meadows and colleagues.
Jorgen
Randers, right.
Who's in China now.
He's
heading up the Club of Rome China edition.
Yikes. What do you think about that, Cynthia?
About the Chinese connection, you're saying, or?
Yeah, well, the Club of Rome is trying to influence China now, and
Yes.
trying to influence the Belt and Road Initiative, trying to steer ecological civilization in a very negative direction. Jorgen Randers, who's one of the original authors of Limits to Growth, he's at some university in China, and they've tasked him with presenting to the Chinese government with suggestions about how to do ecological civilization. So it's very, very disturbing that they've identified China as the future, and they're trying to influence its development now.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a surprise at all that they would try to get China on board with this, because China is such a massive economic driver that if you want to, I mean, this is the inspiration of the World Economic Forum, is to influence world policy. You're going to have to also have China on board with those policies, and if not, then it's not going to look so good for them shaping the clear vision that they have. And I guess one thing I would say on this is, from my standpoint, I've seen a real kind of turn or like change in strategy from the World Economic Forum, in the sense that they were promoting people like Harari much more heavily a few years ago, which they seem to have taken a bit of a pause on, not necessarily a step back from. And Harari was clearly very critical of China. There was a lot of negative talk about China. He was speaking at the World Economic Forum, including the Q&A that was with Harari after his main presentation, which was very, a negative outlook of China. But I think that we're going to actually get, I guess, into geopolitics before we talk about energy, but I mean, it makes sense. It's all connected. Because of the Ukraine war situation, this whole thing of what Davos, I think, thought that they were going to have planned out has not worked out, because the plan for the Ukraine war, no matter, whose side you're on in the situation, was to see an internal collapse of Russia economically. And they were hoping to economically isolate both Russia and China. And there's been other things too that has been trying to weaken China economically through these kinds of economic warfare. But it didn't go as planned. And I mean, some of it was kind of silly, because Russia is a huge weight in as an energy provider. Nonetheless, they thought there was going to be, internal unrest in Russia, and that Putin was going to be overthrown, and that Russia was going to kind of be adopted into the Western framework way of thinking, because there are a lot of Russians, in Moscow that are catering to that kind of outlook. So that didn't work out. And now there's an energy crisis in Europe, which there was already an energy crisis, but the Ukraine war just showed how the emperor has no clothes, basically.
Yeah.
And that their system of renewable energy and all this is actually not sustainable. Yet Germany is, crazily, last I heard, they're still, if they have not already, shut down their last 3 nuclear reactors.
Yeah.
And Germany is a country that I think they started in 2011 an aggressive policy towards renewables, and it's been shown to be a complete sham because they are completely dependent on so-called dirty fossil fuel energy from other countries, and even the hydropower, the nuclear power of other countries like France or the Scandinavian countries. So it's a complete disaster, but they're still continuing to try to project this like false image of success because there's a lot of people with a lot of money who are throwing, a ton of money at this, including, Mark Carney, who's involved with the Bank of England, and he's also been involved with the Bank of Canada, and is basically trying to, create a situation where you cannot get any kind of investment, you can't get any funding if you're not in renewables. And this is just exacerbating the energy crisis, but they're making it sound like this is all Russia's fault, which it clearly isn't. So in the case of China, and I'll get, I realized I was kind of forgetting the first question. I'll sum it up with one sentence. And then China was put in a position where it was like, are you going to continue siding with Russia or not? And so Russia and China have decided to continue with this alliance, which is also an economic alliance. It's an alliance for their continued existence, along with, I would argue, the majority of the world. And so there is now a situation of panic because if you watch like the Davos conference from just like this past February or January, it was, I thought, very telling because you could tell that the moderators were clearly having this kind of they were trying to calm the audience down because there was a clear unrest amongst the people at the stuff because this is 1 year after the Ukraine war and it's a shit show, and the everything is tanking, nothing is doing well. So if you're actually like a somewhat reasonable, rational business person, you don't even have to be moral. It doesn't make any sense what's happening right now, and nobody was very happy. There was very low confidence, and it was clear in like several of the big panels I was listening to, all of the moderators were clearly trying to put people at ease for all of the unrest and all of the basically cynicism at this point that the West can't actually deliver on the promises that they were making. So yeah, okay, if you're promised that there will be a successful Western hegemony and you want to put all of your money into that, fine. But if the Western hegemony is not working out, why would you not want to work with China? And so that's exactly what's happening. And get, China in with like AI, the World Economic Forum wants to control how AI is implemented in all of these countries that are the leading countries in AI. And unfortunately, Singapore is one of those countries that has done it. From my knowledge, they're the only country that has been silly enough to allow the World Economic Forum to do this, but they really want China. And I do not see China going along with that.
Yeah. Well, all the plans are getting foiled because of this new German word I learned, which is Dunkelflaut, which is when the wind doesn't blow for a few weeks. And that has foiled all the plans. Is the Dunkelflaut.
That's so silly sounding.
All the plans hinge on no
Dunkelflaut.
It all hinges on Dunkelflaut not happening.
Oh, wow.
It's been happening too much, so the West is falling.
Wow. Well, let's work backwards because I love that you have both the scientific and the geopolitical perspective on all this, because that's what you need to understand the full picture now. And this article is great because it walks through. It's very scientific, and it presents basically the just science that we here in the West are not presented with, and that's why everyone's depressed. Everyone's like, there's no future. The planet's going to light on fire and we're all going to die, especially on a day like today where we're having all this haze from the wildfires that are coming down from Canada.
There's a lot of eco-anxiety today.
A lot of eco-anxiety today.
Among the guy I worship.
But if you have so many great scientific points that you walk through in this article that say, wait a minute, actually, things have been progressing in a great direction. And there is a ton of hope for the future. So let's go through a few of these. So what do I have here on my list? Dunking, I say you dunk on the Malthusian model, which does not account for qualitative change. Seems like quantity versus quality is this argument that you're getting at, right? You say that you point out that we're increasing diversity and efficiency in the biosphere, making an argument about how we've improved upon fruits, vegetables, things like that to make them better, right? Bigger, better, tastier, more nutritious. But this idea that we're actually increasing diversity and efficiency in the biosphere, that sounds like the exact opposite of what environmentalists say. They say we're destroying the ecosystem and species are going extinct at a rate that they'll all be gone soon, right?
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of fallacy to deal with, like, in just what you brought up. But I guess to start with the Malthusian model, for people who are not aware, the environmentalist movement and also just the typical understanding of how evolution, works, through Darwin's work, which then also influenced the field of cybernetics. It influenced the field of social Darwinism, which, contradictory to what people say, that Darwin was not supportive of that, he clearly was in his writing. He was concerned with what he himself said was the basically that our race was like being contaminated with lesser traits that we didn't want, sort of thing. And he compared it to horse breeding, that no species would allow their worst to reproduce, sort of quote. I'm paraphrasing, but it's in many of our articles, Matt Errett's and mine, where we've repeated that statement. And he said himself that he was directly influenced by Malthus. So the problem with Malthus, who started this idea that population growth is going to be a crisis at some point, and is when our resources are so-called limited. And so when we hit a population size that is going to obviously supersede the resources that are available, this is going to be a crisis point. And he had estimated at the time that it would be 100 years from when he made that prediction. It was obviously very much off of the mark, but the issue too was that he had implemented very inhumane policies, thinking that it was a crisis that needed to be avoided, and people were denied medical care. He was saying that parents who have more than one child, I think, and past a certain time of their marriage, that these children should not be given any kind of care from the state, because these children will have little worth and they will be quickly replaced. He said, we should court natural disasters like the plague to have natural curbing of the population and so forth. So, with these people, poverty was actually a justified thing, in the sense that it would shorten the unwanted lifespan of people. The problem with this thinking, which there's several problems with this thinking, but in terms of the scientific problem, not just the moral problem of it, is that it's not true. And his projection is a linear projection. And part of the problem is his estimate of which is the same problem that the limits to growth model uses, where they had a supercomputer as well that was estimating when we would also hit a crisis point. That's basically using the Malthusian parameters. You have to have like an idea of like, when are we going to hit a point where the resources are going to run out? You have to have an idea of like, okay, well, what is the amount of resources we have? And that will always be an estimate to begin with. And that's how they make their prediction. But the issue is that we have innovation. And we have change, which has changed our qualitative relationship to resources. So just like the limits to growth supercomputer model said that we would run out of like chromium, gold, silver. They also said fossil fuels we would run out of by 2020. that these predictions didn't happen, number one, because their estimates of what the resource quantity was wrong, but also it was their estimation of our relationship qualitatively to the resource. So as like, for instance, mining gets better or our ability to use the resource gets better, the relationship to that resource depletion changes. But almost everything on Earth, especially, you know, the most necessary things that we think of in terms of just naturally food and water and all this, they're all renewable. But what humans do, which is what has been heavily attacked, and I think that it's been done consciously, I don't think that it's a mistake, that they have made this honest mistake thinking that humans are not able to do this. Humans can actually change things for the better. So even these renewable cycles that we see naturally occurring on Earth, we can make those cycles actually more plentiful, including food. You know, where most people who eat fruits, right? These like videos where they show like, oh, the natural bountifulness of nature and everything, and then they think of like these wonderful foods that we eat and everything. Almost everything has been engineered by humans over centuries, including the fruits that you eat: watermelon, you know, bananas, eggplant, carrots, peach. All of these things have been engineered to be much, much better, much more juicy.
Yeah, you have a great illustration in this article that people should check out, and we'll link to it in the description in the show notes. But you show natural corn used to be like tiny, used to be like a few 19 millimeters, and now it's like a whole ear of corn that you can like bite off. You know, watermelon used to be just 50 millimeters, and now it's like bigger than your head. Just two examples of this, but keep going.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that that's a really nice example, right? Because this was before we had any of the kind of technology that might be controversial, depending on how it's used. I agree myself, but like people have become very anti any change that is a human change. The thing is that the world that we even think about ourselves existing in, that is a world that is somehow going to naturally provide for us, is actually a world that we have intervened upon for centuries. So it's an illusory idea, first of all, of how nature is not actually naturally bountiful for humans. We've made a lot of changes such that, you know, the foods that we eat are much more nutritious and much more tasty and last a lot longer than they naturally were found in nature at the very beginning. And actually, I was reading Alex Epstein's book, Fossil Future, which is an excellent book, making the argument as well that, you know, today the world predominantly relies on fossil fuels. And I think that people are constantly lied to about this fact that here's one thing. Like you said, that the world is actually getting better, and people are like, what the hell? The world is getting better. If you he took a survey of some, you know, supposedly well-educated, you know, university campus in the United States, and they were asked like, so do you think that poverty has been increasing, staying about the same, or decreasing significantly in the world? And almost all of them said poverty was increasing, and a few of them said it's staying the same, and like very, very few said it was decreasing. The reality is, which you can find in any graph, like the Our World in Data, you know, will have a graph on this as well. The world poverty has decreased by like over 80%. We have like about 10% world poverty, and the definition of poverty obviously is still like, it's an extreme standard, but like we've decreased that by a huge margin, despite the fact that it seems like there's ongoing war and there's like ongoing problems in these parts of the world. Poverty has actually been addressed and reduced drastically, and the reason for that has been because of fossil fuel use, which is still by far the cheapest energy that people can have, and it's actually not as dirty as people think because our use of it has become more efficient, for one. But the future, obviously, and we'll get into this hopefully at some point in this talk, although we have a lot to go through, is nuclear, which has a much higher density, and fusion energy, which nobody hardly ever talks about without like a scoff. This energy, nuclear already, it is a zero carbon energy, which is never brought up. It's the safest energy, even though that fact doesn't like to be brought up. And again, if you look at any graph, they will tell you it's the safest energy, safer than wind, solar, and so forth. Solar actually has a lot of problems making it because its materials are quite toxic, and its waste disposal also is very toxic, and there's no solution right now to what will be a crisis of solar panel waste. But it's also extremely energy dense and cheap. So this nuclear energy is actually a really good thing. And what Europe is doing in terms of like claiming a war on not just fossil fuel energy, but on nuclear energy is without an alternative. Okay, it's not like renewables can actually replace these energy forms. If they could, then it wouldn't be an issue. But the thing is that renewables cannot, and they've received a ton of funding. Many of these things have been on the market for several decades, and they're nowhere near capable of replacing fossil fuel energy, not just in terms of cost, but in terms of actual use and versatility in use, which is another thing people don't know, is that energy is not just for electricity. You need energy for other types of things, including industrial processes and stuff. Like solar and wind actually don't generate the kind of energy that you need to even make their own material to build them.
Yeah, I like to say that renewables are kind of like a fancy hood ornament for gas and oil, because they don't actually replace them. They just sit on top of them and look fancy and make people feel good about themselves.
Well, it's ridiculous that they're talking about these electric cars, for instance, right? And electric cars will almost always have to depend on some kind of fossil fuel plant. Ultimately, it's not the kind of clean energy, or clean energy everyone is talking about. By the way, wind and solar are not actually clean energy anyway. They say clean energy in the sense that there's no carbon, which even then I would say, like, for the waste disposal, I don't know if that's necessarily true. But there's actually a lot of problems with wind and solar in terms of like the toxicity of in terms of building it and dealing with the waste. But electric cars will have to rely on ultimately some kind of fossil fuel energy for the reliability, because wind and solar simply cannot deliver a consistent, reliable energy to anything.
Right.
So these electric cars are actually predominantly dependent on fossil fuel. So it's just a complete charade. And it's like a false projection. So what is it ultimately about? Well, it's about this Malthusian limits to growth World Economic Forum outlook, which is ultimately a political outlook.
It's funny to see the degrowthers be very against electric cars now, because it's a continuation of car culture. And they have, they realize, like, oh wow, in the limits to growth model, planetary boundaries, electric cars, they make it, they require so many rare earth minerals to make, and they're so heavy. They're much heavier than regular cars. So degrowthers are just like, oh, well, either eliminate private car ownership, so 20 families will share one car, or we just all live in 15-minute cities, and you don't need an electric car.
I think it's a big charade, and everyone who knows that, like, it's bullshit. The whole renewable energy thing is a big charade, and it's just going to take a matter of time before people catch on to it. And that lag time that they have before it becomes to the point where they can't hide it anymore, that's where they're going to try to get away with as much as they can, shutting down nuclear, getting rid of fossil fuel, and they're going to try to push it as quickly as they can before it just becomes untenable and people realize, actually. actually we're killing ourselves by doing this. But just to back it up a little bit to farming and stuff, I'm curious about your opinion on things like organic farming and GMOs. Do you have people seem to have very strong feelings about those things these days. So what is your take on that from like sort of a scientific point of view of like man is improving upon nature? How does organic farming and GMOs, how do they fit into that?
Well, yeah, that's the sad thing of why I think a lot of people have become anti-technology in general is because, unfortunately, the way technology is used today is largely not to our benefit. But it's not to say that technology, that's the inherent nature of technology, but it's because we live today in, I'm talking now in terms of the Western framework, a corrupt system where, the military industrial complex owns the scientific departments in universities at this point. This is the reality of today. It's very political with, who gets grants, who gets funding in terms of research. So it's very difficult as a scientist if you have certain kinds of ideas that are not for a certain political platform, you're not going to get the funding.
You mean your science won't get believed? That's not the science we should believe when they say believe science.
that and also I know a few people who have been they're so desperate for funding that they allow themselves to be bought up by what was the military company? I'm forgetting now, but they were bought up, and then you have to sign a non-disclosure agreement, right? And they own your research, so they can decide to shut it down. And you can't talk about it. You can't regenerate that research. And that's what a lot of scientists have been in the situation of increasingly. It's like really difficult now to get research. And that's the problem, right? Because there are so many good ideas. And that's part of the reason why I think that we lack optimism and positivity. Then you have companies like Monsanto that is using clearly genetic modification in a really horrible way. And they have the suicide seeds and all of these types of problems and who knows what.
I don't know about the suicide seeds. What is that?
Oh, that when you plant the crop, you have the crop will not regrow naturally. Because you can have the cycle, and some things will regrow the next year, and especially if your weather is fine, I think everything should regrow. I'm not an expert in this, but anyway, you should always be able to take seeds regardless, even if it won't naturally regrow. You can take the seeds from whatever crop you've done, and you can then take those seeds and replant it the next year. What Monsanto has done is said that is made it such that the crop will die and there are no seeds, and you have to
repurchase
your
them
seeds again from them. So you're completely, you don't have any independence in your ability to grow.
So it's not that they're genetically modified, that's the reason they're bad.
They're genetically modified to not produce seeds.
It's that they're using the technology in a way to hurt humanity, right?
Yeah. So, because technically, what we've done with fruits to make them better has been a form of genetic modification before we had the ability to even know what the genetic domain was, right? Right. So these kinds of changes that we've made centuries ago were in that domain of genetic modification. So it's clear, nobody can eat anything that technically hasn't been genetically modified from that standpoint.
Yeah.
In the sense that we have changed the domain of food and agriculture over centuries of agriculture's, intervention into this. So it's fine from that standpoint. And just because it's done in a lab doesn't mean that all of a sudden it's like bad. It's like the same idea with radiation. It's like, okay, a nuclear plant has a radiation. That's bad. But then like the hot springs and the beaches that have radiation. Yep. Oh no, that's good radiation because it's like natural radiation. That makes no sense. It's radiation, it's just...
Yeah, Fox was giving a talk about energy in New York State a couple weekends ago, and it was at a bar, and somebody was asking about, it's a very prominent thing down here with Indian Point Nuclear that unfortunately, the Malthusians won. They're decommissioning the plant, and they have all this titrated water left over that they're going to release into the Hudson River. And people, Riverkeeper and all the environmentalists have incited a panic saying that, oh, they're going to poison our river with this radiation. And so somebody asked about that, and they were holding a beer, and the beer that they were holding had more radiation in it than an entire gallon of titrated water. That you could put your mouth on Indian Point and drink the titrated water, and you would get less radiation than from one beer.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah, and like in my paper too, there was that really wonderful graphic on bananas, right? And that like 50 million bananas is the equivalent of 5 million microsieverts. So if you were to say 5 million microsieverts has been dumped into the ocean, people would freak out. And then if you say 50 million bananas, they'd be like, oh, well, that's too bad. But
or going on one airplane ride. If you go on an airplane ride, people are like, oh, pregnant women and children are going to get poisoned by the nuclear plant. If you let a child or a pregnant woman go on an airplane, apparently you're dooming them. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Again, the graphic that another graphic was saying it's equivalent to 0.9 bananas if you live 15 miles from a nuclear plant, and 400 bananas if you fly from New York to LA in terms of radiation. So 40 microsieverts to fly from New York to Los Angeles, and 0.09 microsieverts if you live 15 miles from a nuclear plant. So people just don't understand the world that we live in, and that radiation is not a bad thing. We have background radiation. We actually need radiation to be healthy.
Yeah, I like measuring everything in terms of bananas.
So our audience is already like, we're super pro-nuclear podcast. So I want to touch on some of these other items actually that you say here, because there's a ton of really good stuff in this essay. So you talk about space as a factor, how there's this idea that we're taking up all this space, and that's nonsense. I also love this idea. You talk about man-made forests, and I thought that is the coolest thing, because it's framed as we can actually make forests that are optimized with our own touch, our own man-made touch. Whereas here in the West, we're sort of trained to think that the virgin forest, the untouched virgin forest, is the ideal. But actually, we can optimize forests as well. So do you want to talk a little bit about the man-made forests in India and China?
Yeah, sure. So quickly, just on like the amount of space, I was also shocked that, for instance, you can fit approximately, because now the world population is a bit, according to this, 7.4 billion, you can fit into Texas, which is about 170 million acres, and that you could put each person, you'd have a population density of 27,000 people per square mile, which is about a 30 by 33 by 33 inch plot of land per person. So that's enough space to fit a townhouse for every person on the planet.
That's a decent amount of space too.
Single family zoning.
A 33 foot by 33 foot house. Like, that's actually a good amount of space.
You probably have a little lawn too.
Yeah. So this isn't even like crowding people that much.
Yeah.
In this experiment.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, obviously, I'm not saying that we should, be that close together, but the fact that we can have the entire world population fit into Texas in such a humane, way shows that we really don't have a limit of physical space. And then if you look at the charts showing our agricultural production, it actually has been increasing. And in the areas like the United States, I think it has been kind of plateauing, but that again is a political issue. The farmers in the United States have been heavily under attack through policies, and it's making it very difficult for them to sustain themselves financially. So that has nothing to do with our ability to actually grow food. But if you look at China and Brazil especially, they're doing great in terms of increasing food production. But overall, everything is on an upward trend, except perhaps the United States. And then agricultural land per capita has also decreased for all countries, all areas. And that's according to our world and data. And if you look at the world population increase, so from 1960 to 1980, we've had about 1.4 billion increase. From 1980 to 2000, again, a 1.7 billion increase. And then to today, it's again a 1.7 billion increase. So we've been able to still increase our food production, decrease our land use. So those are very positive statistics. And that's not even us doing things as efficiently as we could if we actually got our shit together. And so the lack of resources is really in localized regions. And that is, again, more of a political and economic situation. It has nothing to do with, natural scarcity or a limit to resource or of space or ability to produce food. So in the case of China and India building forests, I did a presentation actually on the greening of deserts. And I thought wow, I was thinking this title should be super positive. People should be really excited. We can green deserts. And I actually had some people after the presentation ask me well, what about the desert ecosystem? And it was
Gaia worshiper detected.
And it was well, hold on a second, because you can't win the way that your theory is working at this point. I don't even understand how it makes any sense, because if you're worried that the world is getting hotter, clearly you don't want more desert area. And if you want the less CO2, trees are going to consume that CO2. If you want more water, the trees are going to keep the water in. If you want more biodiversity, that's also going to happen if you green areas.
You're killing the scorpions.
Yeah, you have to be careful. These people are allergic to logic.
Well,
wait, hold on. And if you want to decrease the hurricanes, the number of hurricanes that hit the eastern coast of the United States, which has been shown to largely come from the hot air moving over the Sahara, which is which makes up half of the land mass of the world desert. The Sahara is massive. Yeah. So all this hot air that moves over the Sahara Desert that then hits the cold air of the Atlantic and then hits the eastern coast, that's what is causing most of the hurricane activity. So we would also decrease, the storm presence, in this area. And this person was okay, but we need to protect, the desert ecosystem, which is actually much more complex than we thought. And it's but aren't you blaming humans for having created the desert? But that's the other thing, right? This is the ultimate theme. We can only be blamed, which, by the way, we are not the reason why the Sahara Desert exists. All of the water is underneath the Sahara Desert, and it's not really clear how this happened. The Sahara Desert used to be actually very green, and all of the water is underneath right now. And I'm sure that we can find a way to bring that water back up, but we're not to blame for that. But anyway, they're going to, of course, blame us for the Sahara Desert, the humans, and then we're not allowed to fix the problem either. Because how dare a dirty human try to fix a problem of nature? It's just you can't do anything.
And I'd much rather green a desert than put a solar farm on it.
Right.
I have seen, the only time I support this check the biodiversity argument for the desert is if they're proposing a solar farm, and then I want to talk about the noble scorpion and the endangered snakes and stuff like that to block the solar farm.
That's right.
Block the solar farm and then plant trees and turn it into a jungle.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's how is it that having massive land use for solar panels isn't going to increase the temperature, surface temperature by quite a bit?
Nope. Fact check. We can do farming underneath the solar panel. There's a specific kind of sheep.
Right.
They can't. I was reading about it. It's called agrivoltaics, and it's basically this giant cope by the solar industry to say like, oh, we're actually not going to destroy farmland. And it's like the only animal you can have is sheep under solar panels, because goats will jump up and destroy the solar panels. Cows are too big.
You know how the ruling elite love sheep.
Yeah.
They love.
Yeah,
They
I have a
hate
hard
cows.
time
They love sheep.
I have a
Yeah.
hard time believing that that's actually going to work out. But yeah, for China and India, they have increased the number of forests that they have by quite a bit. And NASA even, has recognized this, and you can even see a nice, satellite map that they have on the NASA site that's showcasing this. And probably one of the most successful examples of China greening a desert is the Loess Plateau, which is so striking when you look at it on the internet, the before and the after pictures. Everyone thought that like people were really mocking China when they were trying to do this, saying like they have no idea what they're doing. They're planting, too much of like one kind of tree or shrub or whatever, and it's going to be a complete disaster. And it's like, it looks fantastic. It's truly amazing, and just goes to show that we can have, like, China and India are like one of the most densely populated countries in the world, and yet they also have the most green at this point because of man-made intervention to grow those forests. And I'm sure they're not suffering from forest fires as well because they're actually properly managing their forests. So there you go.
It's almost like human beings make the planet better. Weird how that works.
No,
isn't it?
That's heretic speak.
I mean,
speech.
There's so many good bullet points in here. If people have eco anxiety, I'm just gonna send them this this article, right? I'm gonna say, believe this science. What else do we have here? There, you talk about CO2 generators and greenhouses, which is, I think, a great argument against this idea that CO2 is killing us, because plants love it. Why else would there be CO2 generators and greenhouses, right? Let's see. What else do we have here? If the social progress index is undoubtedly linked to energy production of a country, and nuclear fission is safe and clean, why is there a suppression of nuclear power when it has the capability of massively increasing the standard of living throughout the world, which is from your essay. And you bring up that this is really a plot, right, against industrial growth. And that in order to move to this next phase, we need an international cooperation and collaboration. And that the reason we lack nuclear power is for no other reason than political. It's not because it's too expensive or too hard to build, or there's not enough time, or it's too dangerous. All these excuses are all bullshit, right? It's all political, right?
Yeah, and I think that if we had a better idea of the kind of universe we live in, we would understand that things like nuclear energy are actually, I think, a very natural thing for us to be doing. And I mean, that's how true science works, right? So you can define like what is bad science, or evil scientists kind of, work, which is that anything that goes against natural processes will be a bad approach to science or technology. And anything that goes along with what is a natural, lawful process, that is something that is that should be used, and that is used for the good. And so part of this problem is that we've almost had a religious viewpoint of humans just being bad by our very nature, to want to prosper, to want to grow, to want to use industry, to use tools to make things always better, which actually also affects the world around us. But we can do it in a qualitatively good way. It doesn't have to be a destructive way. And so by understanding even just like how galactic processes work, how the solar radiation works with us, and getting this better understanding, we can I think, start to think of these things as not something, scary or, evil. Like, it's very odd that like radiation has this viewpoint, right? Like radiation is found everywhere, as we were talking. So why this idea that radiation is something inherently evil, so that, these nuclear plants, one of the biggest arguments is like the radioactive waste, which is very minimal for one. We have a technology that can actually deal with that waste now at this point, the breeder reactors. We just need more of those types of things. But the real problem is that humans are not allowed to create anything that will have long-term consequences anymore. That's what has been forbidden. That's what the European Union's policies with Fit for 55 and all of this is what they want. And it's ultimately, putting us in a mind frame where we view ourselves as feudalistic peasants rather than people who are empowered, creative, sovereign, good individuals that can always apply solutions to problems, and they can make things better. That's an empowered, strong viewpoint of yourself, versus someone who, like, I watched Planet of the Humans, and it was very yeah, it was very sad because like he's bringing up a lot of good points about like how we've been lied to with all of the promises of the renewables, but he doesn't actually look into what is the reality of the fossil fuel energy, what fossil fuel energy has done to uplift the world. You know how most people were using for energy was dung that they were like burning in their like houses. And it's like incredibly toxic. Or even wood. If you burn wood in your house, that's not good to be breathing in all of the time. And so people don't even have a concept of like people were using before the, oh, heaven forbid, dirty fossil fuels, which have shown that they don't actually have the kind of pollution that they did during, the industrial age in Britain, back in the day when, everything was like covered in black soot or whatever. But that's the thing, is that he couldn't go there because it was already it was like a forbidden terrain. And so the conclusion from Planet of the Humans is to basically accept that we don't have a place here on Earth.
Yeah, it ended up having kind of a Malthusian bend to it.
Very Malthusian.
I'll see your Planet of the Humans. I'll raise you how to blow up a pipeline. It's, One of our Patreon perks is that we do movie nights in our Discord sometimes. So we watched How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and it was so ham-fisted and tacky that they wanted to make a movie where the eco-terrorists are actually the good guys. And it was just insane how these people, there was no nuance whatsoever to the idea that they're destroying people's livelihoods. They're doing a lot of damage, to the earth by unleashing all this methane, by blowing up a pipeline. The
environmentalists were cheering the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline, even though that released a whole bunch of bad chemicals into the water. So
they don't care about being hypocrites. It's weird.
It's an ideological viewpoint, and they will get upset if you try to prove to them that humans can actually be good.
Yeah,
very odd. Like there's an example actually from Alex Epstein's book, where some scientists he cited in British Columbia, he was able to figure out how to grow a lot more algae in the Pacific Ocean. So it's like a big algae farm, such that like not only did it replenish the salmon by way more than it was before even the certain date. Sorry, I don't know the details of this. But to the point where like a whole bunch of ocean life was flocking to this really successful algae farm, including whales. And Naomi Klein had made a statement saying like, I was on some kind of cruise, watching these whales. And I was thinking at first, like, what a wonderful sight. But then, it dawned on me that all of this was being shaped by human, human human intervention, and that somehow that made the whole thing sick to her, that all of these animals were going to a location where they would have lots of food to eat, but it was somehow just disgusting and, abominable because a human had created that situation.
Yeah.
And it's like, at this point, you have to acknowledge that you have an issue with humans themselves, and then you have to wonder with these people, especially Naomi Klein. I'm sure she lives a very comfortable lifestyle. How do you justify enforcing this viewpoint, which is going to, let's be realistic here, these policies that want to eliminate fossil fuels by 2030, according to the lunacy of Europe. Anyway, that's for Europe, but they want it for the rest of the world. And it's going to affect the rest of the world, what Europe does anyway. That's going to result in people dying.
Yep.
People are just not, they're acting like it's just like a consumer choice. Like, oh, I can pick box A of cereal or box B of cereal. It's not that.
Yeah, no, it's Malthusianism with extra steps. And they're pushing that by 2030, elimination of fossil fuels here in New York too. They're trying to get rid of fossil fuels here in New York, being pushed by the Democratic Socialists of America are leading that charge. But, Alex, you bring up this point about the environmentalists being hypocritical. And we can say that, I think, at a surface level, but, and let me know if you agree with this, Cynthia. I think that ultimately they're not hypocritical because it's not that they're being hypocritical. It's that they're not showing what their actual motivation is. And their actual motivation is based off of this idea that human beings are a virus on the planet. And once you recognize that as the underlying thesis of their actions and their motivations, then all of a sudden their actions make sense and they don't seem hypocritical at all. It's like, oh, okay, this is what you're going for. And I think this is where people who are opposed to environmentalists and they say, oh, they're such hypocrites and why are they doing this? They don't even follow their own rules.
Still flying a plane.
And they're still flying on a plane. The renewables don't actually work. Why are they pushing for them? They're actually environmentally terrible. Well, it's not really about the environment. It's about humanity. It's about the view of man that human beings are evil and bad and shouldn't be here and are a virus on the planet. Would you agree with that, Cynthia?
Yes, and I think that there's two, I guess you can say, as Matt would say, flavors. I hate saying that expression, but yeah, two flavors of it, in the sense that you have the kind of more common person's interpretation of this, which I think is associated with a real existential crisis. I think that these people are going through a lot of depression because they can't see anything good in the world with them situated in it and playing a role in that. And I think that like the best that they can do is to limit the destruction of their own species. Like that's the outlook that they have, which is a very sad outlook if you believe that nothing good can come of your own kind. And the best you can do is to limit or even sabotage your own kind. Yeah. Then you have like the global elite type way of thinking about this, such as like the World Economic Forum, the Club of Rome, limits to growth idea, which is that, yeah, they're just simply lying to you because they want you to be disempowered. So that first grouping I was talking about, that is a disempowered grouping. If you think that you cannot accomplish anything good and you cannot, make anything better, you cannot provide solutions, you cannot change a situation for the better, that is a disempowered outlook that you have. And it's in the benefit of the people who want to rule in such a way that they don't want to have prosperity for all, because they also have a religious belief, which I'll get into. It services them the best if you want yourself to commit suicide.
Yeah.
It makes their lives easier. And their religious viewpoint is also tied to something that is also very dark about what defines human nature. But they tend to, have it more contaminated with the people who deserve more and the people who don't deserve more, right? But they ultimately think that we do live in a world where you cannot trust the masses, and they think of the masses as like, I guess scary swarming of ants or whatever that will consume everything that they touch. You can't trust the masses to be responsible. You have to manage the masses. That's one part of it. But also they're not loving, creative people. So if you don't have a loving, creative outlook of yourself, you're going to be very cynical of what are positive possibilities in the future. And so unfortunately, people who are very paranoid and who have this outlook, they've been working very hard at, trying to enforce policy. Whereas I think some of the better people, they've been a bit naive on some of this, and they just get maybe very excited over their little project here and there, but we're really lacking in the West anyway, people who understand the top-down consequences of these policies. But both viewpoints, the World Economic type of viewpoint and then the more common type, they're both tragic. And the people who think this way, including a Harari, who himself can't even really explain why he is useful. He can't explain why anyone is useful in the world. It's not a happy disposition, and I think that these people are ultimately tools to other people. And if you look at that kind of a world, it's like, Harari himself has said, like, how do you know what someone by their sexual disposition and what they desire? That shows like what a low person Harari is. That's like what defines what you're thinking. Is like what makes you horny, basically.
Yeah, it's a very visceral kind of, we're just feeling creatures. We're not anything higher than just sensorious creatures. We're just but yeah, we have a human brain that can come up with ideas and creative thoughts, and that's what separates us from the animals, right?
I think I'll add a note, because since you have a very nuclear friendly audience, they should get very excited about nuclear fusion. And I think that one of the brightest points to what we can do in the future, and like we've already discussed, like there's enough space, we have the capability to produce food, and we don't have to rely, like the whole genetic modification thing that's being enforced with an evil intention. That doesn't, like, that's what Europe is also like right now trying to enforce with taking away the fertilizers and all this and saying we don't need to do that because of genetic modification. We have naturally, where we're at right now with the old techniques, the capability to produce enough healthy, abundant food for everybody. We don't need as much land area. And we're able to green deserts. We're able to affect ecosystems in a way that is actually a positive contribution. And then for nuclear fusion, the plasma torch, we have the capability of actually changing the domain of material in general. So like, not only will we be able to now reprocess any kind of material, including waste, so there will be no more landfills, and you can reduce it to its elemental components. You can rebuild anything you want using this technology, including improved materials like steel, a stronger steel than we're capable of creating right now. And you don't have to do mining processes as much as well with this sort of technology, because you can reduce the waste into its elemental forms. So it's really now a much more harmonious relationship that we have to the material that we're using on Earth. And we're, again, making an upshift in the quality of what we are making through the use of a fusion plasma torch. And the plasma torch already exists through fission, but it's a lot more expensive because of its high demand of electricity. Going to be much more accessible commercially with fusion energy, which is totally possible. I believe that China will probably be the one to first succeed in the fusion energy endeavor because they actually want to. And, the Lawrence Livermore, school in the United States is only, somewhat catching up, but it's not in a very honest fashion because they work for the military-industrial complex. They don't really care about making this something that's commercially available.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the plasma torch because that was on my list for sure. And that's something I don't know a whole lot about, but the idea of a torch that basically incinerates garbage is amazing to me because I think one of the few things that still resonates with me from the environmental movement that they use to scare people is showing like giant landfills all the time. And sometimes I feel guilty throwing out my garbage every week and be like, oh, I'm producing all this waste and where is it going? And so that's one of the few things where I'm like, oh my God, that's like game changer, it reshifts everything because to think that, oh, we're just using things up and shitting things out and creating waste. Actually, no, we can actually fundamentally change the idea of garbage in the future to the point where it's the ultimate recycling.
Yeah, and we can
environmentalism. It's the ultimate recycling is this plasma torch, which, like you said, already exists. It sounds science fiction because nobody hears about it in the US and it sounds like made up, but it already exists. And the only way it can exist commercially, as you're saying, is if we have more energy, and we need more energy with nuclear power. And then this is the step. These are the steps. This is the future. And then we just have to step into it. And to go back to something else you said about how people become very sad and depressed about where the world is going, and then ultimately cynical about human beings. For me, I think one of the main things that helped me sort of see the world differently and say, no, humanity has a big, bright future, regardless of what's happening here in the West, is looking at countries like Russia and China, which are bringing the world into a new era. And here in the West, especially in the United States, we're so used to being number one, but we're not number one anymore. And I think that's okay. I'm ready for America to take a step back. And I think it's imperative not only for people to understand the real science, which is what we're talking about today, but to understand geopolitically that Russia and China are not enemies of the American people. They're enemies of the parasites that rule over us and that are holding us back. And that the sooner we recognize that they are our friends, and that they want to collaborate with us, the quicker we can get to that future that we're talking about today.
Yeah, I completely agree. And if people could make that shift, it would be everything. And I would make another point as well that, the Cold War doctrine has been going on for about 77 years now. And that's another thing that, I do quite a bit of research on, all of the things that have happened using the justification of Cold War to take away the civil liberties and the press freedoms of people, including McCarthyism, COINTELPRO's attack on the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War that never had to happen, which was justified by the Rand Corporation, which is continuing to justify a war with China now, same Rand Corporation. But people have to realize that the United States has been in a kind of War Emergency Act for 77 years. And that's why, your constitution, which, I'm from Canada, we don't actually have as many rights as Americans do in the sense of like constitutional rights and our legal system as well. But the way that they're circumventing those rights that you have, which made the United States actually quite unique and stood out, is that they're justifying that your rights come secondary to national security. So it's in their best interest to always be pumping this distrust of Russia and China. The other, of course, aspect to that is if there was economic partnership, it would be a lot harder for this vision to succeed of a kind of world economic forum, Bill Gates, one world government thing. I'm not saying that these are like the highest players in it, but that gives you the kind of coloring the idea. Whereas what is presently governing Russia and China, it is anti-Malthusian. And even India has increasingly been pushing back on these kinds of policies. India at the Davos conference, they said outright, that we cannot provide for our people using simply energy. And so we will use energy that can adequately provide for our people. And that's that. It was a very polite way of saying we are not for a Malthusian policy.
And finally, I think India was held back so much for a long time, by the G7 countries. There was a big movement to only provide India with appropriate technology, limiting the amount of intensification that they had. There's a lot of history in America of blocking uranium from going to India, so they can't become a nuclear power country. So it's great to hear that people there and the leaders are starting to push back against all that.
I'm optimistic. It sounds like you guys are also optimistic, and we just have to be, I think, very clear on what policies actually have as an intention ultimately, and we know that our capability or our potential can be for the good, but it is a decision that we have to make to fight for as well.
You've been listening to the Space Commune podcast. I'm your host, Fox, here with Alex. And today, our guest is Cynthia Chung, who is the president of the Rising Tide Foundation and a writer at Strategic Culture Foundation. She also has a Substack. You can find cynthiachung.substack.com. Cynthia, what else do you want to plug today? And also thank you for joining us.
Thanks again, too. That was a great discussion. I actually would plug my husband, Matthew Ehret's paper, because I think it just covers a lot of stuff we were talking about today, called The Roots of Modern Eco-Terrorism, from MK Ultra and the Unabomber to Maurice Strong and Yuval Harari. I think it's a very interesting article.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Everybody should read.
That sounds awesome. Yeah, we got to get Matt on here. He's been on my live stream before, but we got to get him on the show too. You guys are a power team. I love it. We're so in line with like everything that you're doing. It's so hard to find people who are pro-Russia, pro-China, and pro-nuclear and anti-Malthusian. So it's really awesome to have you on. Space Commune is a media project by two upstate New Yorkers seeking an alternative to the degrowth and deindustrialization paradigm being thrust upon us by the Great Reset agenda. We love our country, the United States of America, and take inspiration from our revolutionary founding. We want win-win cooperation with Russia and China in developing the world economy for all of humanity and to make America great again. If you enjoyed this podcast, consider joining our Patreon. We also make other content such as documentaries on YouTube and streaming and essays you can find on our website at spacecommune.com.